Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 2 of classes. I hope that your first week went well and that everything is going great for you. So this will just be a brief lecture about different theories of multimedia that will help sort of set us up for the rest of the class. So I'll break down a few different theorists and sort of their major contributions to thinking about multimedia, and then we'll think about how to apply these sorts of different theories and understandings to our own work in this class. So let me go ahead and get my slides up for you. Okay, you think I'd be a little faster, but I didn't teach online last semester, so I'm a little rusty on Zoom, unfortunately. Okay, all right, so we'll talk a bit about different theories. Okay, so I'll give you a few different theorists and their major contributions. We'll think about the relationship between visuals and text, because yes, multimedia texts often have sound or movement, as we talked about last week. Remember the GIF with Kristen Bell, right? So different sorts of ways to communicate, but we often, especially in this class, I feel like end up focusing on visual, right? And we live in such a visually stimulating, sometimes overwhelming culture that I think it makes sense that we end up talking about visuals quite a bit. So we'll focus a little bit on that. And then we'll talk about affordances and constraints of visual media, and I'll talk more about what that means. Okay, so like I said, first, some big ideas about multimedia. So just as a refresher, multimedia and multimodal text, and remember we talked a little bit last week about the distinction between the two. Media is the package that something's coming in, right? So is it text? And mode is how it's communicating sense-wise. So is it visually, is it textually, is it linguistically, is it orally, right? Is it gesturally? That's the distinction. Again, we're not going to get super bogged down in it, and we will use those terms sort of interchangeably, but I do want to remind you, like, there is a distinction. So, okay, so multimedia texts can be print-based, right? So it can be a newspaper layout or a magazine layout. So that's something that would have images as well as alphabetic text, right? It can be digital or screen-based. So it can be a television show, right? With subtitles as text, or even without that, you've got visuals and you've got audio and you've got movement. Google Slides, another example of a digital or screen-based multimodal text or multimedia text, right? It can be something live, right? Like a theater production or a concert, right? You've got multiple modes of communication there. And then it also can be transmedia. And so this term is not something we'll spend a lot of time on, but you might see it come up, and I just wanted to explain it briefly. So transmedia is basically taking multiple forms of media in order to create something new or to create a more immersive experience. And so it's very experimental. I think an example of this would be if any of y'all have heard anyone talking about the metaverse lately. I think Mark Zuckerberg has been, and I think Bill Gates and some other folks are saying, like, the metaverse is this next space. So it's basically like a digital space where, like, a digital world in which you would sort of act out things. So I believe Roblox would be, if you're familiar with that, would be an example. Or even, I guess, Minecraft. I know a lot of you started talking about Minecraft last week. That could be an example of like an immersive transmedia experience. Anyway, we won't talk about it a ton, but I wanted to bring it up because it's a term that is associated with multimedia. So remember, medium is the material form that carries the message. So think about the medium as sort of the packaging, right? Like, what is the packaging of this message? Okay, so the first big name we'll talk about is Marshall McLuhan. He's a theorist that was writing in the mid-20th century, and he has this really famous piece called "The Medium is the Message." And it was pretty controversial and still is a little bit, but he basically breaks down modern communication. And when I say modern, I mean 20th century. So if you think about sort of the explosion of technology, telegraph, telephone, radio, television, it's just like a huge expansion of technological growth in a very short period of time as far as history is concerned. And so he gives us this sort of structure. Okay, So he divides it into the message, which is the content, right? So what's actually being said, and the character, he calls it character, but it's basically style. So how is it being said? Is it formal? Is it informal? What kind of language is being used? What's the mood? What's the emotion? That sort of thing. So that's the message. And then the medium is the packaging, like how you receive it, right? Is it from a television commercial? Is it from a print ad? Is it from a telephone, a telemarketer, right? Like it might be the same message and content and style, but it's going to come in a different package. And according to McLuhan, and this is why it was so controversial at the time, he's arguing that the medium is actually more important than the actual content of the message. So, I think we can find a middle ground on this and say that they're both equally important, or in different contexts, they're different. I don't want to get too far, because we could talk about that all day and come up with examples all day. But if you think about, the conclusion that I would come to really is sort of the nature of the medium is just as important, because it shapes our response just as much as the message itself. So for an example of this, think of a time when you received bad news. Maybe it was through a text, or maybe it was through a phone call, and you really would have preferred to get that news in person, right? Or, some other, basically the same situation, but you feel differently about it. So let's say somebody said something to your face and you wish they'd written it out, or you know what I mean? Like, it might be the same content or the same message, but you interpret it and you experience it differently as the audience, depending on the medium. Okay. So I think that point is well taken. And that's something we can definitely keep in mind, because I think that is part of the power of multimedia, is that packaging, right? That's what makes it so powerful. Okay, cool. Great. So just briefly, McLuhan was writing at a time when this debate of this question of what is the relationship between technology and society was really raging. And I mean, it still is. Like, there have been so many conversations about social media in the last decade, right? And I mean, even in the last few months with Facebook and sort of the different whistleblowers and things going on with social media, especially Facebook, what is the relationship? And so you have sort of three camps, and this is dating back to, the 1950s or earlier even. But you have people that really think that technology is sort of the determiner or the determinant of society. Okay, so technology shapes society, and I think you can find examples of this that would suggest this is true. You have other folks that think it's the other way, right? Like, society is the ultimate power, and that's sort of where all of technology comes from, and that's what shapes us and things like that. And then you sort of have this third, which of course I fall into, is sort of they're in a relationship, they're reciprocal, right? So there are things about technology or elements of technology that definitely shape social practices or society, and then vice versa, right? Because oftentimes technology is developed in response to some sort of need or a gap, right? So it's more of a relationship. And so I definitely find myself in that middle ground. I think if we were having a live class, we could talk about this, and feel free to leave your comments on this material on Classroom. If you have like examples of this stuff, that would be great. But I wanted to bring this up because you'll see these different attitudes in some of the things we read. And so I think it's important to think, when you're reading some of the stuff we read for class, okay, what is the standpoint of this author, right? Like, which way are they thinking? And I think that can help us unpack some of the more difficult readings. Okay, so let me clear this, because otherwise it will stay on and I will forget about it. Okay. So another big thinker that we need to bring up is Gunther Kress. Might be Gunther, I don't know, probably Gunther, sorry. So he's writing about multimedia and genre. So when I say genre, sorry, I like forget I have water in front of me, and then I just keep going. Excuse me. Okay. So when I say genre, I think probably the first thing everyone thinks about is different types or categories of books or movies or music, right? It's genre is shorthand for categorizing the media we take in, right? So are we going to go see a rom-com this weekend, or are we going to go see a thriller or a mystery or a horror movie, right? It's a way to organize media, right? So Kress is talking about taking the idea of genre and applying it to visual tools or visual modes of communication. So, right, when you think about genre, we often think about like a romance novel, right? It's very focused on texts, like, and of course, you know, it applies to music and movies, but it's very bound into this like creative space. And so Kress is arguing that we can take this concept and it can help us understand multimedia, especially like the visual. So the example he uses is a diagram drawn by a student on a science test in a corresponding graphic in a textbook. So if you think back to middle school or high school, and I mean, like the first thing I think of is trying to break down like the mitochondria, right? Or the parts of a cell. My drawing of that in my notes in my 8th grade science book is not as beautiful or polished as the one that's in the textbook, right? But hopefully it has the same information and can do the same thing, right? It can have the same purpose, but its qualities or styles might be a little different. Okay, and so that's what he's saying, and I think that holds true too. So I want you to think about what genre or genres does an artifact or a text fall into? And I think that can help us think through this as well. Okay, so briefly, we'll talk about text and image, because like I said, we focus a lot on visuals in this class. So the third person, and perhaps, I don't know, not the most important, but a very important, is Roland Barthes. So he wrote a very famous piece that talks about the relationship between linguistic, symbolic, and literal messages. And I'll break this down for you. So according to him, when you're looking at visuals, right? If you're like, let's say you're looking at an ad, because in this, he talks about a pasta ad, which is this pasta ad. We'll come back. How do you interpret that text? Okay, so he says we've got 3 messages. Every image has 3 messages, sort of, or 3 types of messages that can layer upon one another. So the first is linguistic, right? So that's the actual alphabetic text that we would read. So in linguistic has both denoted and connoted understandings. And so I always remember this from very early elementary school. Denoted means the actual like dictionary meaning of the words, right? So remember the D for dictionary and denoted. And connoted is basically what is implied, or what is maybe not explicitly said, but implied or suggested. Okay, so that's the linguistic. Then we've got the literal and the symbolic for the images. So literal is that denoted image. What is the actual image? Like, what is it a picture of? Okay, if we have to break it down into what are the actual objects in the image. And then there's symbolic, which is what the images make you think of, what they imply, right? So if we're talking about advertising or marketing, this symbolic is really what it's all about, right? Oftentimes, that's like the power of good advertising. So for example, so this is the ad, the famous ad in his piece called The Rhetoric of the Image. So it's this ad for pasta sauce and pasta itself. So the linguistic message, right? So it's in Italian and I don't read Italian, but you know, I assume this says like pasta sauce, Parmesan cheese, right? Luxury Italian or something like that. So that's the linguistic message. So I think literally we can translate it, but also the fact that it's in Italian, I personally, because it's Italian food and I associate Italian food with being very fancy, right? It's like for me anyway, and I love Italian food. So anyway, sorry. I always want to talk about food. It's just like such a good topic. Anyway, so there's a little bit of that, you know, suggested going on here. But then when we look at the image, right, you've got the literal image is you've got a produce bag, right? You've got the fresh vegetables, and then you've got the actual product itself. And then symbolically, I think this is when I guess somebody could say we were reading too far into it, but like that's what Bart is saying, is like this has a symbolic message. So for me, my interpretation is, oh, they've got the pasta products with all this fresh produce, and we've got the produce bag. It must be really fresh and delicious, right? And it's sort of like must be gourmet, you know. That's the stuff that's suggested. So all of these different parts, the text, the visuals, and if you break down the visuals into like the colors and the fonts and the quality of the photo, all of that works together to communicate with the audience. And so if we go back to McLuhan, the whole argument, you know, the media or the, I'm sorry, I'm totally blank. The medium is the message. I'm sorry. It's been a very long week. Please forgive me. So if we go back to McLuhan and the medium is the message, I think that argument is very interesting in this scenario, because you could just write a full page ad of text that maybe says all the stuff I just said. That is not going to be interpreted or experienced in the same way by the audience as this is. So I think that's like an interesting point to think about personally. Okay, so here's another example. So this is an ad for WVU. And sorry, I just got rid of my pointer and now I'm like, come back. So this is an ad for WVU, right? And so if we look at the linguistic message, so we've got the mission, building a future, strong military families are the backbone of student veteran success. And the new WVU Veteran Military Support Headquarters, you and your family will find the tools you need, like this, this, and this. Learn more here. So linguistic, it's like, and then you've got Ed's information. So linguist, it's like, here are the words, right? But it has an underlying suggestion, right? So building a future, it's supposed to make us think, especially if we're a veteran or from a family, a military family, oh, this is a place I can go where I can build my future, right? And so there's certain, strong military families, backbone, like there's all this sort of language that makes you feel a certain way. And that's in addition to like what the text is actually saying. And then if we look at the images, so what's the literal message of the images? It's a picture of a family. You've got red brick in the background, right? Over on the quad. You've got the flying WV. Literally, that's what's there. But symbolically, what does this do, right? It's a family. You've got the little boy. You think about, building economic wealth, intergenerational wealth. You think about, kids growing up, and then also, and then also going to WVU, right? You've just got, my mouse is really touchy. I'm so sorry. You've got all these different forms working together, right? And I think that that's sort of a good way to look at it here too. So beyond a pasta ad. So I want to leave you with a question, do text and images have the same function? I won't answer that. Just think about it. And so what, that's a question that you can sort of explore or investigate with your multimedia artifact analysis, which is sort of the big assignment for this week. So you're going to pick an artifact. And when I say artifact, I know you probably think of museums or something, but I think it's just kind of a way to say an artifact. It's just something like an item. So it's something with text and sound, text and visuals, movement and sound, whatever. It's a multimedia text. And then in 500 words, you're going to answer the following questions. So what is its purpose? What is its effect on the audience? How or why is this its effect? And then how do the different modes of communication work together to achieve or not achieve this goal? So really pick something that's interesting to you, that you feel like you can talk about and that you have questions about. Think about its purpose and think about how it's achieving or not achieving that purpose. And that's what I want you to do. And feel free to go back and use any of these ideas we talked about in this lecture today, or anything from the readings from this week or previous weeks. All right, if you have any questions, as always, please leave a comment. I feel like a YouTuber, like smash that like button. Please leave a comment with a question and I will get back to you. All right, thanks for sticking through it. See y'all later. Bye.